They think it's their idea, The Psychology of Influence. Published by Veridian. Introduction. You know that strange, warming thrill you get the moment someone else suggests exactly what you were secretly thinking? The light bulb goes on, your shoulders relax, and you say, "Yes, that's perfect," as if you had discovered the idea yourself. That moment feels like victory. It is victory. The person who planted a suggestion has just accomplished the most efficient, elegant form of influence. They made you feel like the author of your own decision. This book is about that quiet, underrated craft, making others feel ownership of the ideas you introduce. It's about the psychology behind why people prefer to adopt choices that feel self-generated, how clever communicators exploit that tendency, and how you can use the same principles ethically to persuade without coercion. Whether you're trying to lead a team, sell a product, win support for an idea, parent-child, or simply navigate conversations with more ease and less friction, the core skill is the same. Help others feel it was their idea all along. The reason this works is simple and stubborn. Humans hate being told what to do. More precisely, we are wired to protect our autonomy and our self-image. When we believe a choice originated inside us, it reinforces our sense of agency and integrity. We call this phenomenon many things: psychological ownership, cognitive consistency, the endowment effect, internal attribution. But underneath it sits a single truth. People prefer to follow the voice they believe is their own. That preference colors every decision we make, from the big, which career to pursue, to the tiny, what coffee to order. This book unpacks the mechanisms that create that sense of ownership and shows how to design conversations, pitches, and environments so that good ideas feel like the listener's ideas. I don't write this as a manual for manipulation. Quite the opposite. Influence loses its value when it undermines trust. The techniques in these pages are powerful because they align what you want with what the other person genuinely wants. When influence is authentic and benevolent, it makes relationships stronger. The persuaded person doesn't feel tricked, they feel understood. Too often persuasion is taught as a grab bag of tactics to overpower resistance. What I offer here is subtler and, frankly, more effective. Methods to remove resistance by inviting collaboration, curiosity, and self-discovery. Used responsibly, they lead to outcomes everyone can be proud of. Throughout this book, you'll meet stories. A product manager who increased adoption not by redesigning the product, but by reframing the onboarding, so users felt they tailored the tool to their routines. A teacher who turned an entire class from passive to engaged by letting students generate the project prompts. A sales conversation that turned into a mutual plan simply because the salesperson asked a few well-timed questions. You'll also find the science behind those stories. Experiments, cognitive biases, and social dynamics, but always with an eye toward practical application. Each chapter takes one angle of influence and breaks it down into clear, repeatable behaviors so you can test them in real life. We'll begin by understanding the mental architecture that makes their idea feel more appealing than your idea. We'll look at commitment and consistency, why people stick to choices that feel self-made, and at how memory and mental accounting color our attachment to decisions. We'll explore conversational moves that guide without pushing, from strategic questioning to the art of selective framing. You'll learn how small choices, the order of options, the language you use, the stories you tell, produce major shifts in ownership. We'll also cover the social levers, authority, scarcity, and social proof, and how they interplay with a person's internal narrative to create real, lasting buy-in. A practical part of the book addresses traps and ethics. Influence can be used to help people, and it can be used to take advantage of them. I'll give you a moral framework to decide when and how to use these techniques. You'll get red flags, signs that what you're doing is tipping toward manipulation, and corrective practices that restore balance. There's also a chapter on resilience, how to recognize when someone is trying to sneak influence onto you, and how to reclaim your decision-making power without shutting down collaboration. Toward the middle of the book, we'll dig into advanced strategies, how to bootstrap ownership in groups, how to design choices that lead to self-sustaining change, and how to orchestrate environments so people make the right decisions for themselves. These are the tools leaders need to create cultures where ownership and initiative flourish naturally rather than being forced. The last chapters bring everything together into playbooks you can use immediately. Conversation scripts, meeting structures, product design checklists, and exercises that train you to think like a steward of other people's autonomy. If there's a single promise I can make, it is this: you will not leave this book with a bag of tricks. You will leave with mindset, a way of seeing influence as the general art of enabling others to discover what's already aligned with their values. You'll notice, in the days after you read this, how often people want to call something their idea, and how much easier life is when you help them do that honestly. To get the most from this book, do two things. First, read actively when a technique is presented. Try it the next day in an actual conversation. This is in theory to admire from afar. It's practice to try and refine. Second, keep a short influence journal, 1 or 2 lines after each attempt. What you tried, how the other person reacted, and what you'll change next time. Small iterative experiments will make these principles real far faster than passive reading. Finally, a small warning. You might find yourself deliberately stepping back in conversations to give others space to shape an idea. That can feel odd at first, like letting go of control, but it is the secret to gaining it. Influence that looks like surrender often turns into the truest kind of leadership, one where people join you because they chose to. If you're ready, let's begin. Chapter 1 will take you inside the mind of the decision maker and show how a simple change in framing can transform resistance into authorship. Chapter 1. When I was 28, I sat in a cramped cafe across from a potential co-founder and watched a conversation that felt like a small miracle. We had been circling the same problem for weeks, pitching ideas back and forth, none of them landing. Then, almost by accident, I asked a question that shifted everything. If you could design this tool for your own morning routine, what would it do? He paused, sketched a half-baked diagram on a napkin, and within 10 minutes we had a plan so simple and right that it felt like his discovery. He left the cafe energized, and I left with a partner who owned the idea completely. That evening I understood something fundamental. People buy harder into ideas that they feel they created. This isn't magical thinking. It's the architecture of human decision-making. From the earliest moments of childhood, we're taught to value autonomy. We bristle at being told what to do, and we celebrate when we can claim credit for our choices. That need for personal authorship shapes how people receive suggestions, whether from friends, bosses, politicians, or salespeople. Chapter 1 is about mapping that terrain. What happens in the mind when someone encounters an idea, and which subtle forces determine whether they accept it as their own? First, autonomy matters because it fuels identity. We don't merely choose options. We choose stories about who we are. When a person endorses an idea, they're not just agreeing with a proposal. They're folding that idea into their self-narrative. If the idea feels foreign or imposed, it threatens that narrative. If it feels self-generated, it reinforces it. That's why questions that invite contribution, how would you do it, or what feels right to you, work so well. They turn the listener into a co-authored solution. When people help craft a decision, they don't have to bridge the gap between an external recommendation and their internal script. The idea already fits. Second, commitment and consistency are powerful engines of influence. Psychologists have shown that once people make a small commitment, they tend to follow through with actions that align with that commitment. It's not that people are irrational, it's that consistency simplifies life. If someone publicly endorses a small aspect of a plan, they're more likely to adopt larger parts of it later because their mind seeks coherence. That's why the act of generating an idea with someone, even by suggesting small, seemingly inconsequential details, can seed a cascade of ownership. The more someone contributes, the harder it is for them to later disavow the conclusion. Memory and mental accounting play a role as well. People remember the process of coming to decisions, not just the end result. When a person has mentally rehearsed a solution, repeated it aloud, or sketched it out, those mental steps become a breadcrumb trail that reinforces the idea's origin. Asking someone to explain how they would implement an idea or to list the first 3 steps they take creates cognitive footprints. Later, when they revisit the choice, those footprints feel like evidence that the idea was theirs from the beginning. There's also a quieter bias at work: self-attribution. Humans have a strong tendency to attribute positive outcomes to internal dispositions and negative outcomes to external circumstances. If a person reaches a desirable conclusion, they're inclined to think they arrived there because of their own insight. Skilled influencers don't force conclusions. They create conditions where the listener can arrive at a desirable outcome and then feel the rightful satisfaction of their cleverness. This isn't trickery when done ethically. It's aligning good outcomes with genuine personal insight. Language is the toolkit for this alignment. Little shifts, using you instead of I, framing ideas as questions rather than declarations, and inviting examples from the listener's life encourage people to internalize concepts. Contrast "we should do X" with "what would happen if you tried X." The first is an imposition. The second solicits authorship. Another useful habit is to avoid immediately fixing problems for someone. Instead of offering a polished solution, hand them the first half of a sketch and ask them to complete it. The act of filling the gap fosters ownership far more effectively than presenting the finished product. But practical habits alone can't cover the ethics. There's a moral line between guiding someone to discover and manipulating them into adopting something they wouldn't endorse with full information. The difference lies in intent and transparency. If you intend to help someone reach a decision that genuinely benefits them, and you're open to their objections, your methods will look like facilitation. If you're hiding costs or silencing dissent, you're crossing into manipulation. One simple ethical test I use: could I outline to the other person afterward exactly why this choice served their interests and still feel comfortable with what I did? If the answer is no, stop and reassess. Practical exercises at this stage are simple but revealing. The next time you want someone's buy-in, try the 2-step sketch. Present a problem and then offer a partial solution, no more than a rough outline. Ask the person to add 2 specifics that would make it work for them. Notice how their energy changes and whether their suggested details become the things they later defend. Another experiment: when you catch yourself saying you should, replace it with one question: how would you? See how often the conversation shifts toward ownership. Keep a small notebook and jot down what works. Patterns will emerge that you can reuse. In the end, the lesson of this chapter is straightforward. Influence begins by honoring other people's need to be authors of their lives. When you respect that need, you open the only door that truly leads to persistent buy-in. People who feel ownership don't just agree. They act, defend, and sustain. They become collaborators rather than targets. That's the foundation of influence that lasts. We'll build on this foundation in the next chapter by exploring the specific conversational moves that encourage authorship in real time, how to ask better questions, when to remain silent, and how to turn resistance into opportunity. For now, take a moment to remember a time when you claimed an idea that later felt utterly yours. Replay the steps. You'll find the same mechanisms at play. Once you can see them, you can use them, and importantly, use them well. Chapter 2. There are moments in conversation when the shape of an outcome changes in a sentence. A question asked at the right time can crack open resistance like a wedge. The same question asked clumsily can slam the door shut. Chapter 1 explained why people cling to ideas they feel they own. Here, we learn how to steer real-time dialogue. So, those ideas emerge naturally, not by force, but by design. This chapter is a practical field guide to conversational moves that reliably invite authorship. The right kind of questions, the power of calibrated silence, ways to reframe objections so they become stepping stones, and the art of incremental commitments. Start with questions. Not all questions are created equal. The worst are yes/no traps, or leading questions that telegraph your desired answer. The best are open, specific, and scaffold. Open questions, what concerns you have, sound welcome but are often too broad and produce vague answers. Specific open questions, what will be the first 3 steps you take tomorrow to make this work? Force concrete thinking without imposing your view. Scaffold questions are a sequence that moves someone from reflection to small action. The pattern I use most is 1. Invite perspective. How do you see this problem? 2. Invite specifics. What would success look like in 7 days? 3. Invite experiment. What's one small thing you try first? That sequence turns fuzzy judgment into implementable ownership. There's a difference between curiosity and interrogation. Genuine curiosity earns trust. Interrogation provokes defensiveness. To sound curious, ask follow-ups that surface reasons, not just facts. Instead of why did you do that, try what was your thinking when you tried it. The second invites explanation and preserves dignity. Good follow-ups reflect what you heard. You said reliability is a priority. How does that change the options? Mirroring someone's language signals that you're trying to understand, not control. When people feel understood, they are far more willing to explore ideas aloud and to co-create solutions. Silence is a tool most people underuse. After asking a meaningful question, wait, people hate silence and often rush to fill it. But that rush usually produces shallow answers. If you're willing to sit in the pause for 5 to 10 seconds, the other person will often move from a reflexive response to a thoughtful one. That extra time allows them to assemble a narrative in their head. And narratives are how people make ideas feel like their own. Practice holding silence until the listener speaks at least twice. The second response is almost always clearer and more owned. You'll feel awkward at first. So will they. That's when the real thinking begins. Reframing is another powerful skill. When someone resists, don't rebut immediately. Reframing turns objection into a new perspective that keeps the conversation collaborative. Suppose a teammate says, "This will take too much time." A blunt rebuttal risks escalation. A reframing question like, "If we could save 1 hour a week, would that change your view?" nudges them to imagine a specific payoff. Good reframes pivot from abstract dismissal to concrete trade-offs. The trick is to listen for the underlying value. Concerns about time often mask fears about competence or resource scarcity. Reflect the value first. I hear that time is tight. What will be acceptable trade-offs? And then guide toward solutions that respect that value. Use the power of naming. When people describe their own ideas aloud, putting a short label on them helps crystallize ownership. If someone suggests a new process, repeat a concise name back to them. So you're proposing a quick check routine before deployment? The label isn't for you. It's for them. Labels become hooks for memory and conversation. Once named, an idea is easier for the speaker to rally behind. Be careful. Only label an idea after the person articulates it. Premature labels sound presumptuous and can reverse the authorship you're trying to build. Another subtle skill, the two-step concession. People resist when they feel boxed in. Offering a small, conditional concession early reduces that pressure and encourages reciprocity. For example, I'm happy to try your approach this week if you'll review the results with me next Friday. The concession is limited and framed as a test, which lowers stakes and invites shared accountability. When someone accepts a concession, they've made a small commitment that often grows into deeper ownership because they were the one to agree. Stories matter more than facts when you want idea ownership. Facts build the frame. Stories build connection. But the story shouldn't be yours alone. A better move is to invite the person to tell a story about a time they faced a similar choice. Has there been a time when you tried something like this? What happened? By prompting them to narrate their experience, you allow them to extract lessons and apply them to the current situation. Their own story has greater persuasive weight than your best argument because it belongs to them. Language tone also shapes outcomes. Use tentative phrasing when you want to protect autonomy. Say might and could more than should and must. That subtle softness preserves dignity and reduces reactive resistance. People can interpret tentative language as respect rather than weakness. Equally clear, decisive language is appropriate when someone asks for direction. The skill is discerning which mode the other person needs. If they seek advice, offer it plainly. If they're testing ideas, reflect and expand. Don't underestimate micro-choices. The order in which you present options can bias ownership. People more often choose the middle option when given three, and they prefer options presented first if they're ambiguous. If you want someone to feel authorship over a specific approach, see it as an option in the middle of the set and let them pick it. Better yet, have them generate the options themselves. Even if you prompted them, when people list options, their chosen option feels like theirs, even if you nudge the list behind the scenes. When resistance hardens into a no, treat it like data, not defeat. Ask for the logic. Help me understand which part doesn't work for you. Often, the refusal contains a kernel of truth you can use to redesign the proposal. If the logic is immovable, respect it. A gracious decline preserves relationship and leaves the door open for future co-creation. If a person feels pressured after saying no, they will internalize the choice as coerced and are less likely to re-engage. Finally, practice. 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 Conversational techniques are muscle memory. Try the scaffold question sequence with low-stakes interactions, ordering a meal, deciding on a film, or choosing a meeting time. Notice how the same questions produce different levels of buy-in, depending on tone and timing. Keep a short log of what worked and what didn't. Over time, you'll develop an instinct for which move fits which moment. A closing exercise. Pick one conversation this week in which you want someone to adopt an idea. Before the conversation, write 3 scaffold questions that lead them toward authorship. During the conversation, ask your first question and then stop talking until they respond fully. Use silence deliberately. When they offer suggestion, label it and ask for the first concrete step. After the exchange, note how much of the solution they contributed versus how much you did. Small experiments like this build the conversational architecture of influence. In the end, Chapter 2 boils down to one motto: invite, don't instruct. The more you treat conversations as co-creative spaces, the more people will walk away believing the idea was theirs. That belief is the fuel for action. In the next chapter, we'll explore how to scale these techniques in group settings, meetings, teams, and communities, where ownership dynamics change, but the same principles apply. Chapter 3. The first time I tried to lead a workshop with the explicit goal of making the group feel like the authors of their own solution, I nearly failed. It was a cross-functional meeting, designers, engineers, and product marketers, packed into a glass wall room that smelled faintly of coffee and nervousness. My instinct was to control the agenda tightly, present the options, steer the conversation, and land on the obvious choice. Halfway through, I realized two things. First, people were repeating the same objections and not building on each other. Second, the decision I thought we'd landed on was fragile. No one owned it. That evening I went home and rewrote my playbook. The techniques in this chapter are what I replaced it with. Groups are different from one-on-one conversations because authorship distributes across many minds. Two effects are important to understand from the start. The first is diffusion of responsibility. When a group makes a decision, individual ownership often evaporates into "we decided," which sounds good until the work needs to be done. The second is social dynamics. Status differences, loud voices, hidden agendas, and groupthink can all drown out genuine co-creation. To make their idea work in groups, you must design for both individual ownership and healthy social processes. That means structuring meetings so that contributions are visible, sequenced, and attributable, and creating rituals that let quieter participants influence outcomes without being bulldozed by louder ones. Begin by designing the environment. A meeting is not just a slot on the calendar. It's a system. Who's in the room, their roles, their incentives, and their power dynamics matters more than any single question you ask. Be ruthless about invitations. Only bring people who either make the decision or will implement it. If you want buy-in from a wider group, bring representatives who can credibly translate the decision back to their teams. Before the meeting, share a clear purpose and a one-paragraph context. Ambiguity breeds defensive posturing. When people arrive knowing the problem and the boundaries, they're more likely to invest in shaping a solution. Start meetings with small, structured moves that generate micro-ownership. One technique I use is the silent brainstorm followed by round-robin sharing. Give everyone 5 minutes to write their ideas privately, then have each person read one idea aloud in turn. Silent writing does two things. It reduces anchoring on the first speaker, and it gives introverts a chance to formulate something they truly own. When people speak their ideas aloud, especially after having written them, they already feel a measure of authorship that carries into the group. The round robin keeps the social dynamic fair. No single voice can dominate the opening. Next, separate ideation from evaluation. Groups collapse too quickly into debating feasibility, which hands advantage to the loudest skeptics. Instead, treat early stages as a no-judgment zone. Capture ideas visibly on a board or a digital tool, and resist the urge to critique. Once the group has generated options, move to clustering similar ideas and ask each person to pick their top 2 favorites privately. Use a voting or a digital poll. Private preference expression does two things. It reveals genuine leanings without social pressure, and it creates a record who supports what, which helps translate vague "we" decisions into individual commitments. Make commitments explicit and low friction. After that voting, don't simply announce a winner. Ask 3 people who voted for it to name one action they would take in the next week to move it forward. Those named actions are tiny ownership seeds. They're effective because public, specific commitments create cognitive and social pressure to follow through. If no one volunteers, something is off. The idea may have been superficially attractive but lacked practical advocates. In that case, Solicit microtasks people will own and keep the tasks lightweight. Progress begets ownership. Leverage roles to stabilize influence. Assigning roles like facilitator, timekeeper, and devil's advocate clarifies responsibilities and prevents authority from masquerading as consensus. The facilitator's job is not to decide but to shepherd the process. Nudge silent participants to speak. Keep the conversation on the agreed criteria, and ensure follow-up items are assigned. A designated devil's advocate, used sparingly and transparently, helps the group test robustness without turning every critique into a veto. Rotating these roles through different meetings builds shared capability and prevents permanent gatekeeping by a few individuals. Use storytelling and reframing at scale. Invite members to tell short anecdotes about times they succeeded or failed with similar decisions. Stories bypass abstract argument and give the group evidence anchored in lived experience. After a few anecdotes, ask the group, what principles seem to recur here? That principle can become the heuristic guiding the choice, something the group can own because it emerged from their own stories. Reframing also helps. When objections appear, turn them into experiments. If someone says, this won't scale, reframe with a conditional test. What small test could show whether scaling is a real problem? Turning a complaint into a test converts negativity into a collaborative experiment and invites ownership of the solution. Pay attention to narrative ownership. When decisions move forward, craft a short, shared narrative that explains why the group chose this path and what comes next. Don't let the write-up be a leader's memo. Make it a co-authored bulletin. Invite volunteers to draft the project narrative and circulate it for edits. The act of writing the how and why cements ownership, because people are literally putting their names and language on the plan. That draft should include visible next steps and named owners for each task. Again, converting we decided into a series of individual commitments. Beware of two common traps. The first is false consensus. People gnaw because they want the meeting to end, not because they own the idea. One practical antidote is asynchronous reflection. After the meeting, send a short summary and ask each person to reply with what they personally see as the first two actions they'll take. If responses are vague or absent, follow up. The second trap is social loafing. When many people are responsible, some do less. The cure here is granularity. Break projects into small, time-bounded tasks and attach them to individuals. Celebrate small wins publicly to reinforce the link between contribution and recognition. Finally, build rituals of review. Ownership at a single moment is fragile. Sustained ownership requires rituals that make contribution visible over time. Weekly show and tell slots, progress dashboards with named contributors, or short retro sessions where the team reflects on what worked and what didn't nurture ongoing authorship. These rituals do more than track work. They renew the social narrative of co-creation and provide the practice space where people's initial commitment becomes enduring habit. Here's a short exercise to try this week with a team. Pick a problem small enough to solve in 2 weeks. Convene a 45-minute meeting. Start with 5 minutes of silent idea generation, then a round robin where each person shares one idea. Cluster ideas and run a private vote. Ask 2 or 3 people who voted for the top option to commit to one concrete action each for the next week. Draft a 1-paragraph narrative together and assign owners to follow-up items. After a week, hold a 5-minute show and tell. Notice how the ownership feels different compared to meetings where you do the selling for them. Group authorship is messy, but messiness is the price of durable ownership. When people claim ideas as their own in a group, those ideas don't just survive, they propagate. They become the operating habits of teams and the culture of organizations. Done well, the art of making ideas feel like others is less about clever persuasion and more about designing spaces where people can discover, claim, and act on the truth they already hold. Chapter 4. A few years ago, I watched a small nonprofit transform its fundraising simply by rearranging the order choices on a donation page. They weren't changing the cause, the stories, or the marketing. They changed the anchor. Where once donors saw a long list of vague amounts with the highest number hidden at the bottom, they began with a clear, specific suggested gift tied to a concrete outcome. $50 provides 5 hot meals. Donations rose not because people were tricked, but because the choice was framed in a way that made the impact feel tangible and, crucially, feel like something the donor had chosen to create. That tiny shift in what options were presented and how they were described is the subject of this chapter. Choice architecture is the invisible scaffolding that turns suggestions into self-authored decisions. At its heart, choice architecture answers a question we rarely ask aloud. How do people actually make choices when faced with options? The naive assumption is that the best option stands on its own and that given perfect information, people will pick it. Reality is messier. People satisfice rather than optimize. They rely on heuristics, default to the easiest path, and are strongly influenced by how options are labeled, ordered, and framed. If you want others to feel ownership, you don't overpower their cognition. You respect it and design choices that let them discover the better path for themselves. The simplest and most powerful tool in choice architecture is the default. Defaults matter because people often accept a pre-selected option, especially when the decision feels complex or when the cost of switching seems high. Defaults are not inherently manipulative. They are practical. We use them every day. Software settings, subscription renewals, workplace benefits, and they can be harnessed ethically. The secret is transparency and alignment with the chooser's interests. If the default is the option that is most likely to serve the person's long-term goals, then enrolling them in that default is an act of service, not coercion. Always make it easy to opt out and clearly explain why the default exists. That preserves autonomy while reducing friction. Framing is a close cousin of defaults. The same fact can be presented in multiple ways, and each framing nudges thinking differently. Loss frames, what you lose if you don't act, often spur immediate action. Gain frames, what you gain if you do act, can be more motivating for long-term commitments. The trick is to pick the frame that fits the decision horizon and the audience. If you're inviting someone to try a new habit, a gain frame that ties the habit to their identity. Become the kind of person who can help them internalize the change as their choice. If you're pointing out risks that require immediate attention, a loss frame can clarify stakes without scaring people away, provided you pair it with manageable first step. Partitioning choices reduces overwhelm. When a decision has too many dimensions, people freeze. Break big choices into a sequence of small, solvable decisions and let the person make each one. This creates a path of micro-authorship. They contribute to each step and gradually build ownership of the whole. For example, when onboarding new users to a complex product, present one feature at a time and ask them to personalize the one that matters most to them first. Each small personalization deepens their sense of authorship and reduces the abandonment rate. Language matters. How you label options determines whether people see them as prescriptions or invitations. Recommended for new users is kinder and more helpful than best option because it invites the chooser to relate the recommendation to their situation. Use first-person phrasing when possible. Let people imagine themselves in the outcome. I'll get more organized if I choose this is more compelling than this leads to more organization because it invites internal endorsement. Likewise, Avoid moralizing language that implies obligation. People resist being told they must do something. Invite them to imagine, test, and decide. Timing is another lever you must respect. People are not constants. Their openness to influence fluctuates with mood, context, and energy. If you want someone to choose a new routine, the best time to influence may be during a transition moment, moving to a new job, the start of semester, or after a personal milestone, when self-narratives are more malleable. Designers of successful programs often hitch a new behavior to a life transition because people are already revising their identity and are more receptive to choices that feel self-authored. Pre-commitment devices are useful when you want to convert initial authorship into sustained action. If someone genuinely suggests a course of action, ask them to make a small, time-bound commitment that makes the first step visible. Public commitments are powerful because they tie identity to action, but use them sparingly and always ensure the commitment is feasible. Impossible promises breed resentment and erode trust. The goal is to create a momentum loop. Small, achievable commitments that produce quick wins and make continued choice feel like the natural path. Testing choices matters. Design is iterative. When you can run inexpensive experiments, A/B tests, small pilot groups, or paper prototypes. Watch not what people say they will do, but what they actually do when presented with choices. Often, there's a gap between predicted preference and real behavior. Those gaps are rich data points. They tell you where the architecture is misaligned with how people think and feel. Use those observations not to fix people, but to simplify the path so their genuine preferences can show through. Ethics must anchor every choice architecture decision. There's a thin line between making a helpful path and manipulating someone's decision. Ask yourself, does this arrangement respect the chooser's long-term interests? Is opt-out easy and obvious? Would you be comfortable explaining the design and its rationale to the person you're influencing? If you can't answer yes, redesign. Influence that survives scrutiny and still benefits the chooser is the kind worth practicing. A practical exercise is to audit one decision point you control, a meeting agenda, a product sign-up, a family chore list. Map the current choices people face and note how many steps each requires, what the default is, how options are labeled, and where the emotional friction is highest. Then pick one small change. Reorder the options, make a helpful default, or break a big choice into two, and test it for a week. Track what happens and whether people report feeling more like authors of their choices. Small interventions often reveal disproportionate effects. Choice architecture isn't about removing freedom. It's about scaffolding the path so that smart, benevolent options are easier to choose. When we design with respect for autonomy, transparency, and simplicity, we help people discover and claim the best decisions for themselves. The result is not compliance, but commitment. In the next chapter, we'll look at narrative strategies, the stories and metaphors that make choices feel personally meaningful and help others weave new behaviors into their identity. Chapter 5. Stories are the mental scaffolding people use to hang meaning on choices. Facts can inform, but stories make decisions feel like parts of a life. If you want someone to take on an idea as their own, help them fold it into the story they tell about themselves. This chapter is about the narrative moves that turn abstract options into personal identities, the metaphors that make complex choices feel familiar, and the small storytelling practices that let people discover and claim the better path. Start with the obvious. People remember stories far more than statistics. A single vivid anecdote can outweigh a spreadsheet of evidence because stories do two jobs at once. They demonstrate plausibility. Someone like me did this and it worked. And they provide an emotional frame. This outcome mattered to that person. When someone imagines themselves in that story, The idea stops being hypothetical and becomes doable. The trick for an influencer is not to invent a story for someone, but to surface or co-create a story that the person can comfortably inhabit. One simple technique is the mirror story. Instead of telling a triumphant case study, ask the other person whether they know someone who faced a similar choice and what happened. When they supply the story, reflect it back with small edits that highlight the transferable lesson. For example, if they speak of a colleague who tried a new process and got bogged down, reframe it. So your colleague tried X, struggled at first, but then they tweaked Y and regained momentum. What if we started at that tweak? By doing this, you're not replacing their story. You're helping them see a version of it that leads naturally to the solution. Ownership grows because the narrative remains theirs. Metaphors are the shorthand of the mind. They let people map unfamiliar domains onto familiar ones. A well-chosen metaphor reduces cognitive load and gives the listener a ready-made script. If a team worries about a new workflow, calling it a lightweight pilot rather than overhaul invites a different emotional response. The former sounds temporary and testable. The latter sounds risky and permanent. Metaphors also carry moral valence. Building a bridge suggests connection and care, while cutting the fat implies ruthless efficiency. When you name a situation with a metaphor, do it carefully and ask whether the metaphor aligns with the chooser's values. If it doesn't, invite them to propose a better one. When people craft a metaphor, they own the meaning. Identity narratives are the deepest lever. People make choices that reinforce who they think they are or want to be. Influence that succeeds is often identity congruent. It proposes a path that feels like an expression of the person's preferred self. The language of identity is subtle. Use phrases like the kind of person who, or someone who values. These prompts invite the listener to mentally place the choice within their self-image. If a colleague values reliability, frame a process as how someone who values reliability would test this. If a friend wants to be seen as adventurous, frame a challenge as the kind of experiment an adventurer would try. The goal is not to manufacture identity, but to connect the idea to an identity the person already signals or aspires to. Narrative pacing matters. People resist dramatic leaps in their personal story. They accept incremental rewrites. Offer small edits rather than whole rewrites. Instead of, you should become organized, try, what's one small habit that would make you feel more like someone who has a handle on this? A proposed tiny step lets a person test drive a new version of themselves. If it fits, they adopt it, and the new identity gains credibility. Over time, a string of small, identity-consistent choices produces a durable self-narrative that feels self-authored. There is power in ritualizing stories. Small public acts, announcing a simple intention, sharing a short update, or naming a new habit, turn private narratives into social facts. If someone says, I'm going to try blocking mornings for focus work, they're creating a public story that their future behavior must align with. This is why commitments accompanied by simple storytelling works. The story explains the why, and the commitment provides a how. Encourage people to tell short, specific versions of their plans. The clearer the narrative, the easier it is to live into it. Language choices steer interpretation. Avoid absolutes and instead use conditional, narrative-friendly phrasing. Imaginative and what would it look like if, invite the listener to paint the scene. Use sensory details sparingly to make the imagined future feel real. What will you see, hear, or be doing? When someone can visualize the next step concretely, they're more likely to take it and later claim they thought of it. Ask them to describe the first hour, the first conversation, the immediate outcome. These details are the hooks that anchor the story in memory. Ethics are central here. Stories can nudge people into identities or behaviors they may later regret if the designer's intent is self-serving. Always ask whether the narrative you're encouraging benefits the person over time. A quick ethical test. Could you describe a narrative and the intended path to the person's close friend or mentor and still defend it? If the answer is uncomfortable, slow down. Influence that respects autonomy uses narratives to clarify values and create options, not to trap someone into a storyline that serves only you. Practical exercises sharpen these skills. Try a story harvest this week. In 3 conversations, ask the other person for one story about a time they solved a comparable problem. Reflect the story back and ask what principle it suggests. Notice how often the principle points to a next step they feel willing to take. Another exercise is a metaphor swap. Propose a metaphor for a situation and ask the person to name a better one. Compare how each metaphor makes the choice feel, lighter, riskier, more noble, and watch which one they naturally favor. Finally, practice the identity prompt. Ask, if you were the kind of person who handled this easily, what would you do first? Then let silence do its work while they envision it. Stories also require maintenance. A narrative that worked in the moment can fray under stress. Keep retelling short versions of the story as people take actions and achieve small wins. These retellings are not propaganda. They're memory aids that keep the new identity active. Celebrate moments where someone behaved in line with a new narrative and point them out. When you did X last week, that was exactly the kind of decision someone who values Y would make. That simple observation strengthens the thread between action and identity. Narrative influence is less about clever persuasion and more about gentle authorship. When you help someone find a story they can live with, one that fits their past, honors their values, and opens a plausible path forward, you do more than sell an idea. You give them a map for becoming someone slightly different and often better. In the next chapter, we'll look at the hidden forces that distort choices, biases, and heuristics, and how to counteract them so people can make clearer, self-authored decisions. Chapter 6. I remember the first time I realized how many decisions we don't actually make. It was during a late-night debate with a friend about whether to accept a job offer. We listed pros and cons like grown-ups, but when she told me why she'd already told the company yes, the reason wasn't on the list at all. The recruiter's casual comment about how everyone here hits the ground running had anchored her expectation of what the job would be like. She had fallen in love with a single phrase. That moment taught me something crucial. Much of our rational choice-making is quietly steered by biases and mental shortcuts that feel effortless until you look closely. Chapter 6 is about those invisible forces and how to design conversations and environments so people can see them, resist unhelpful pulls, and claim clearer, more authentic decisions. Biases and heuristics are the brain's speed tools. They save time and energy by offering rules of thumb. If X looks like Y, treat it like Y. That efficiency is adaptive most of the time, but also produces predictable distortions. Anchoring makes the first number U here a gravitational point for all later estimates. Availability bias lets the most vivid or recent example loom larger than the statistical truth. Confirmation bias filters for evidence that supports what you already believe. Loss aversion makes losses hurt roughly twice as much as equivalent gains feel good. Status quo bias prefers what exists now over even slightly better alternatives because change carries uncertainty. Each of these tendencies colors whether someone adopts an idea and, importantly, whether they feel they invented it. The good news is that these biases are trackable. Once you can name the distortion, you can create simple defenses. Start by slowing decisions down. Most cognitive shortcuts operate fast. Giving people time invites the slower, reflective system to check the first impulse. In practice, this looks like introducing a short wait between proposal and commitment. Ask for a day to sleep on it, or schedule a follow-up conversation, not out of evasiveness, but as a structural feature. Let's each think on this and reconvene tomorrow with 3 reasons for and 3 reasons against. The extra time reduces the sway of immediate anchors and emotional spikes. Another powerful tool is a consider the opposite prompt. When someone is leaning toward an option, ask them to argue for why it might fail. This isn't adversarial. It's curiosity framed as prudence. By forcing the mind to search for counter-evidence, you weaken confirmation bias and reveal blind spots. A related technique is the premortem. Imagine the plan failed 6 months from now and ask, what caused a failure? Teams that run premortems routinely catch problems before they become real ones because they anticipate the failure modes a brain would otherwise ignore. Make evaluation criteria explicit before ideation. One reason biases take hold is that people judge options against shifting, often emotional benchmarks. If you set objective criteria up front, cost threshold, time to value, impact metrics, then later choices are measured against agreed standards rather than against whatever example is top of mind. In meetings, write those criteria on the whiteboard and return to them when objections arise. This discipline transforms debates from impression contests into checklist-driven analyses, where ownership is garnered by meeting shared standards, not by rhetorical force. Separate creation from critique. We covered this in earlier chapters, and it's doubly important here. The mind is more creative when it's not simultaneously critiquing. When people generate options in a judgment-free zone, they produce richer choices that are less biased by the initial anchor or loudest voice. Then, when the group switches to evaluation mode, use private ranking mechanisms like votes or anonymous scoring to minimize social proof distortions. Social proof is real and powerful. People will endorse what they perceive as popular. Private expression reveals genuine preferences and creates a more authentic basis for ownership. Use checklists and templates to counter availability bias. When someone's judgment is shaped by the most recent story they heard, my cousin had a terrible experience. A checklist forces him to step back and weigh the broader evidence. A simple template might ask, what data do we have? What counterexamples exist? How probable is each outcome? And what's the downside? Tools like these convert gut impressions into structured thinking and reduce the persuasive power of single anecdotes. Teach the language of doubt. Many people feel awkward expressing uncertainty because it can look indecisive. Normalize phrases that invite scrutiny. I could be wrong, but, and what would show me I'm mistaken? Encourage people to surface where they lack information and to request experiments rather than hard commitments. This habit creates epistemic humility in a group, which dramatically reduces risky bias leaps. When you're the influencer, practice transparency about how you're helping shape the choice. Say things like, I think the anchor you heard matters here. Would you like to see the broader data? Or, I'm proposing this default because it usually helps people avoid X, but you should know the trade-offs. Transparency builds trust and gives the chooser the information they need to evaluate whether the nudge aligns with their interests. If you wouldn't offend the nudge in front of the person's spouse or mentor, don't do it. There's also a protective script you can teach people to shield themselves from undue influence. When offer recommendation, a simple response works wonders. Thanks, helpful. I'll take a day to think about it and get back to you with a couple of questions. That short delay is a buffer against immediate anchors and gives the chooser time to consult other sources. Another script. Can you show me the data or examples that make you confident? This converts persuasive rhetoric into evidence-based conversation. Finally, remember that some biases are context-dependent and often culturally reinforced. What looks like stubbornness might be risk aversion rooted in prior harms. What looks like impulsivity might be time pressure. Be compassionate in diagnosing biased behavior and humble in offering corrections. The aim isn't to fix people, but to create conditions where their best judgment has a fighting chance. Biases don't make us irrational. They make us human. Influence that respects that humanity will not try to erase these tendencies, but to counteract the ones that misalign choices from values and long-term goals. If you design processes, questions, pauses, checklists, private votes that expose the invisible rails of decision-making, you allow people to step off autopilot and claim their choices with clarity. In the next chapter, we'll look at how to convert initial authorship into sustained change, the habits, commitments, and environments that help people become the kind of people who make better choices by default. Chapter 7. Ownership is a fragile thing. People can claim an idea in a meeting, cheer for it, and then let it gather dust once the next crisis arrives. The true test of influence is not the moment of agreement, but the week, month, and year that follow. This chapter is about turning the spark of authorship into ongoing momentum, how to build habits, commitments, and environments that keep people acting like the owners they believe themselves to be in the heat of the conversation. Start with the simplest truth. Behavior follows architecture. If you want someone to keep doing something, don't rely on inspiration alone. Change the environment so the desired action is easier than the old habit. That could be literal. Place the gym shoes by the door, or organizational. Remove 5 approval steps for a small experiment. When you design for ease, you turn choice into default behavior. The person still feels it's their idea because they set the intention, but the friction that kills follow-through is gone. Micro-commitments are a powerful bridge between intention and habit. People who make small, specific promises are far more likely to follow through than those who make vague vows. Ask people to commit to the smallest possible next step that still moves a project forward. 1 30-minute test, 1 short email, 1 prototype sketch. Public micro-commitments are especially effective because they create gentle social pressure. But public commitments must be realistic. If the first step is too big, it's easier to rationalize inaction than to fail publicly. The art is finding the frictionless micro-step that still matters. Ritualizing action converts discrete choices into identity-consistent routines. Rituals don't need to be grand. They need to be consistent and meaningful. A team might start each Monday with a 2-minute one-win share. An individual might end each day by closing 3 tabs and writing one next action in a notebook. These tiny rituals do 2 things. They create a repeatable habit loop, and they produce a running narrative of progress. When someone can point to repeated, visible acts, their sense of authorship deepens because their identity and their behavior align over time. Accountability structures matter, but they must be chosen, not imposed. People resist externally enforced surveillance. They accept accountability when they choose a partner or a format. Peer accountability, pairs or trios that check in with one another, works well because it combines social support with responsibility. Another option is visible public tracking, a shared dashboard where contributors log small wins. Visibility increases motivation when it's framed as collective celebration, not punishment. Keep the reporting lightweight. A line or 2 is better than a 4-status meeting. Feedback loops sustain momentum. People need information that tells them whether their actions are producing the intended effect. Quick wins are powerful because they provide immediate feedback, but longer projects need staged milestones and measurable indicators. Define what success looks like upfront and show progress visibly. Even when progress is slow, Transparent measurement helps people see that their contributions matter and prevents the creeping doubt that kills ownership. Designed for cognitive bandwidth. When life gets busy, noble commitments slip first. A busy person is a vulnerable person. The more cognitive load you remove, the more durable their authorship will be. Automate what you can: reminders, templates, recurring calendar blocks, and reduce the need for ad hoc decisions. When choices are pre-committed and low effort, people can execute the behaviors they intended without repeatedly re-argumenting for them. Celebrate iteration, not perfection. One of the most corrosive things for ownership is the expectation of a flawless outcome. When people think they must get it right the first time, they delay or abandon action. Make it explicit that the first iteration is a learning step. Use language that normalizes adjustment. Let's try this as a pilot and learn, or we'll tweak after 2 weeks. When teams see iteration as a path to mastery rather than an admission of defeat, they're more willing to act and claim subsequent improvements as their own. Social identity fuels persistence. When a behavior becomes a signal of belonging to a group or identity, people maintain it because it connects them to others they value. Encourage small symbols of membership, badges, brief public recognitions, or a shared phrase that people use when reporting progress. The symbol should be earned through action, not cheaply given. When people adopt a behavior because it signals, "I'm part of this group," their continued action is an ongoing assertion of that identity. Support recovery paths for inevitable lapses. Slip-ups will happen. Busy weeks, illness, or competing priorities will interrupt even the best intentions. The key is to normalize recovery rather than shame failure. Have a simple restart ritual, a short reflection on what went wrong, a recommitment to the next small step, and a visible signal that the person is back in. This creates psychological safety and reduces a catastrophic thinking that makes lapses permanent. Leverage temporal landmarks. People are more willing to change at moments that feel like beginnings, the start of a week, month, quarter, or after a life event. These fresh start moments double the likelihood that a person will adopt a new habit because they mentally segment their life. When possible, tie commitments to temporal landmarks. Let's start the pilot on Monday, or we'll begin after the quarter close. The landmark gives the plan psychological gravity and makes it easier for people to narrate the change as part of a fresh chapter. Teach metacognitive monitoring. Encourage people to notice not just what they do, but why they do it. A short weekly check-in prompt. What went well? What blocked you? What will you try next? Helps people surface obstacles and adapt their strategies. When people reflect on their own behavior, they internalize lessons and feel more agency over future actions. Reflection turns passive follow-through into active authorship. Finally, guard the ethics of sustaining influence. Sustained change can easily slide into coercion if incentives are misaligned or if people are repeatedly nudged toward choices that benefit others more than themselves. Periodically revisit the original rationale with the group. Does this still align with their values and interests? Are the benefits real and shared? If people can honestly reaffirm the purpose, their continued ownership is authentic. If not, redesign. A short practical experiment. Pick one intention you have for the next month, a personal habit or a team practice. Break it into the smallest possible micro-commitment and set up 2 supportive structures. 1, a daily or weekly ritual, and 2, a visible progress tracker shared with one trusted peer. After 2 weeks, run a quick reflection. What changed? What felt easier? What blocked you? Use the answers to simplify the habit, not complicate it. The aim is to make the pathway easier, clearer, and more sustainable so that the choice genuinely remains theirs. Turning a moment of agreement into a lifetime of ownership is less about charisma and more about thoughtful scaffolding. Design the environment, make commitments small and visible, provide feedback, and normalize iteration and recovery. When you do that, the person who once claimed an idea in a meeting will still be living it weeks later. Not because you made them, but because they chose a path that was simple, meaningful, and theirs to walk. Chapter 8. Sometimes influence goes wrong. You notice in the hollow enthusiasm after a meeting, the passive compliance that looks like agreement but smells like annoyance, or the subtle retreat of people who once seemed engaged. Making an idea feel like someone's own is fragile work. When ownership fractures, repair is essential. This chapter is about diagnosing why ownership failed, repairing trust without pressure, and reframing the path forward so people can genuinely reclaim authorship. Think of it as triage in long-term care for influence. First, notice the signs early. Ownership doesn't always collapse dramatically. It often unravels in small ways. Missed deadlines, vague status updates, offhand complaints in private, or reluctance to volunteer for tasks are early warning signs. People might nod in meetings but then forget to act. If you see these behaviors, treat them as data, not a personal slight. The sooner you diagnose the cause, the easier the repair. Diagnosing failure means asking 3 diagnostic questions. Was a person ever offered real choice? Did they understand the trade-offs? And were they given the resources and authority to act? Often one of these is missing. A team member might have nodded because they wanted the meeting to end, no real choice, or a volunteer may have agreed without understanding the hidden costs, opaque trade-offs. Or a department may have been assigned a task their role can't actually execute, no authority. Before attempting to fix motivation, check the structural realities. When you find the root, start with transparency. People respond to honesty. Admit what went wrong in plain terms. I realize we moved forward without checking whether everyone had the authority to act. That was my oversight. Short, specific admissions do 2 things. They model accountability and lower defensive barriers. Avoid long defenses or justifications at this stage. They look like rationalizing rather than repair. Give an authentic opt-out. One common mistake is doubling down. When someone resists, push harder. That creates resentment. A more effective move is to explicitly offer a graceful exit. If this doesn't feel like the right path for you, say so and tell me what would. An opt-out doesn't mean giving up. It's a diagnostic tool. When people feel safe to say no, their subsequent yes are more credible. If they accept the opt-out, negotiate a path to re-engagement rather than allowing the idea to die in silence. Re-engagement requires co-creation, not persuasion. Invite the person to revisit the problem on their terms. Use questions that restore agency. Given everything you know now, what would you change about the plan? Or, if you were designing this for your team, how would you start? These queries shift the dynamic from you as advocate to you as collaborator. The ideas that emerge in this phase are more likely to stick precisely because they come from the person's perspective. Apology can be powerful, but make it useful. A bland sorry feels cheap. If you made a mistake, overpromised, failed to include someone, say what you'll do differently. I'm sorry I didn't include you in the initial scoping. I'll share the background and ask for your 2 priorities before the next milestone is better than silence or a vague apology. The action component of the apology builds trust through tangible repair. If the issue is resource or authority mismatch, make structural fixes visible. Reallocate time, delegate decision rights, or remove bureaucratic hurdles. People won't take ownership if they lack the means to act. Often leaders assume commitment will produce capability. In reality, the inverse is true. Capability begets commitment. Show that you are clearing obstacles deliberately, then invite ownership of the next step. When backlash emerges, people vocalize anger or withdraw public support. Don't posture. Convene a short, candid conversation with affected parties. The agenda should be simple. Surface grievances, validate impact, and propose concrete corrections. Validation matters more than defense. People are less interested in your intention than in the effect. Say, I hear that the rollout fell top down. That was my intention, but I see how it came across. Let's redesign the next step together. Offer to pause the rollout if needed and convert the next phase into a small, consensual pilot. Language matters in repair. Replace we decided with we tried when things stagnate. We tried this approach and it didn't deliver. Open space for iteration. We decided do X can sound like immovable decree. Use conditional language to invite collaboration. What would make you feel comfortable continuing? And which part of this do you want to own? These questions put control back where it belongs. Protect relationships by scaling involvement appropriately. Not everyone needs or wants the same level of authorship. Some people prefer to be consulted. Others want full ownership. Ask people how they wish to be involved and respect those preferences. This avoids imposing a model of co-creation that some find burdensome. A simple matrix, inform, consult, co-create, own, helps clarify expectations and prevents future misunderstandings. Learn and codify the lesson. After repair, run a brief retro. What signs did we miss, and what process will prevent similar breakdowns? Capture commitments in the project plan. Who will check for alignment? When will opt-outs be offered? How will resource constraint be verified? Turning repair into process reduces the chance of repeating the same harm. There are ethical boundaries to repair. Don't use apology and re-engagement as techniques to soften resistance and then proceed with the same agenda. Authentic repair means a person's feedback has a real chance to alter outcomes. If you're not willing to change course, say so upfront rather than feigning openness. That honesty might close the door, but it preserves integrity. Practical scripts that help. When you send shallow agreement, I want to check we're genuine on this. What would make you say no? Be candid. It helps me improve the plan. After a miscommitment, I noticed X didn't happen. Was that because of priority, resources, or something else? When offering opt-out, if you don't want to take this on, say so now. We can reassign or redesign. When repairing trust, I got this wrong. Here's what I'll do differently and how you can change the plan. A short exercise. Identify one stalled project and list indicators that show whether ownership is real, who speaks for it, who schedules the tasks, who removes obstacles. Pick one person with visible disengagement and run a 15-minute repair. Chat using the diagnostic questions above. Don't argue, listen. After the chat, summarize the outcome and share the summary with the person for confirmation. Small acts of repair accumulate into a culture where people can safely claim and reclaim ideas. Ownership sometimes fails not because of the bad idea, but because the path to execution poorly respected people's autonomy or capacity. Repair is not a fix for flawed work. It's a way to restore agency, clarity, and mutual responsibility. When you repair well, you don't just salvage a project. You teach others that their voice matters and that ideas can be reshaped together. That lesson, more than any single plan, is what builds enduring influence. Chapter 9. There's a quiet responsibility that sits behind every technique in this book. Influence is a tool, and like any tool, it can build or it can break. After years of watching ideas catch and falter, I learned to judge methods not only by how well they work, but by what they do to the people whose minds and lives they touch. This chapter is a practical ethics guide. How to tell the difference between persuasion that empowers and persuasion that exploits. How to defend yourself when someone tries to hijack your authorship. And how to teach others to practice influence with integrity. Start with motives. The clearest sign of ethical influence is alignment. Do the outcomes you're steering toward genuinely serve the other person's interests as well as your own? If your primary aim is their welfare, even when it also benefits you, your techniques will tend toward facilitation. If your priority is only what you gain, you will inevitably rationalize shortcuts. That's not to say mutually beneficial influence never helps you. Rather, ethical influence is winsome because it produces real, shared value. A simple test. Imagine explaining your conversation and your methods to the person you're influencing and to someone who cares about them. If you'd be comfortable with either person reading the transcript, you're probably on safe ground. Learn to spot red flags. Manipulative influence often carries certain signatures. It reduces choice, hides crucial information, isolates people from countervailing voices, or normalizes pressure tactics, deadlines that aren't real, manufactured scarcity, or repeated urgent nudges. Another red flag is emotional bypassing. When the other party focuses only on feelings to short-circuit practical concerns, you'll regret not doing this, rather than answering straightforward questions about trade-offs. If you notice these patterns in your own behavior, pause. If you experience them from others, treat them as data about the integrity of the situation. Guardrails matter because good intentions can turn stale without them. One practical guardrail is explicit consent before you run a conversational technique. Especially a subtle nudge, state your intent. I want to help you think this through. Is it okay if I ask a few probing questions? Consent transforms influence from covert steering into co-laboring. Another guardrail is transparency about trade-offs. Always name the costs as clearly as the benefits. When you do this, you give the other person the information they need to say yes or no authentically. Refusal scripts are the underrated skill of ethical influence, knowing how to say no crisply and kindly. When someone pressures you, a short script both preserves dignity and buys time. Thanks, I appreciate the invite. I'm going to sit with this for a day and come back with questions. If you suspect manipulation, a firmer line helps. I don't feel comfortable deciding under these conditions. Let's pause and revisit when we can look at the data. These scripts don't invite argument. They assert boundaries. Practice them aloud until they feel natural. Part of ethical practice is teaching others to influence well. If you lead a team or mentor people, make ethics an explicit part of your training. Include case studies where influence went right and where it went wrong, and ask learners to critique both. Run role plays where one person practices a nudge and the other must identify whether it respects autonomy. Give feedback not only on effectiveness but on respectfulness. Reward behavior that opens space for dissent and punishes tactics that hide choice. This creates an environment where influence is a shared craft governed by mutual standards. Hold yourself accountable publicly. One of the clearest ways to keep influence honest is to make it visible. After a meeting where you use a nudge, share your approach and rationale with the group. I framed the option this way because I believed it would help the team decide faster. If anyone thinks the framing was misleading, tell me and we'll reopen the discussion. Public accountability deters self-serving shortcuts and models an ethic of transparency that others will emulate. Teach people to recognize their own vulnerabilities. Influence is most effective when it meets a need, belonging, certainty, identity. So help people map the needs that make them susceptible. Quick exercises like what am I trying to avoid or what identity am I protecting? Help folks see why a suggestion might feel especially attractive. When people can name their pulls, they move from passive being influenced to active chooser. Build a habit of brief pre-decision reflection. 5 minutes to name benefits, costs, and the identity the choice would signal. That pause is a surprisingly powerful inoculation. Power differentials complicate ethics. When you have formal authority over someone, boss, teacher, parent, you carry extra moral work. The asymmetry means your nudges have more force, which raises a standard of consent and clarity you must meet. Never use authority to shortcut genuine choice. Instead, use your position to expand options and resources and invite own solutions. If you must give direction, explain the reasons and provide a real opt-out where feasible or a compensating choice. The default for power holders should be to err on the side of openness. Repair remains part of ethics. If you realize you cross a line, use a tactic that felt sleazy, omitted a cost, or elicited a coerced agreement. Repair quickly and plainly. Admit the mistake, explain what you'll change, and offer a tangible remedy. Pause the plan, reopen the vote, or redistribute tasks. Authentic repair is often more persuasive than a perfectly executed nudge. It restores agency and trust in ways that clever persuasion never can. Finally, cultivate humility. The most persuasive people are not always right. Influence can create a seductive sense of competence. Because you got people to lean in, you may start to believe the outcome was obviously right all along. Counter that bias by soliciting dissent deliberately and celebrating it. Invite a contrarian voice into your circle and treat disagreement as information, not a threat. The habit of dissent keeps influence tethered to reality and reduces the risk of groupthink. A brief practice to integrate these ideas. For 1 week, before you try any technique from this book, run a 2-line ethics check with yourself. Who benefits most from this nudge? Would I be comfortable explaining the nudge and its trade-offs to the person's closest friend? If the answers pass, proceed. If they fail, redesign the approach. This small habit will shift your default from how can I get agreement to how can I help people decide well? Chapter 9 is a pause for conscience, a reminder that influence is not only a set of moves, but a moral practice. When you pair skill with steadiness, you create a rare thing, the capacity to change minds while honoring them. The final chapter pulls these threads together into a practical playbook, scripts, checklists, and rituals you can use tomorrow to help others feel like the authors of their best decisions. Conclusion. When I first became aware of how often people accept ideas not because they were forced, but because they felt like the idea was already theirs, it unsettled me, not because it was dark or sinister, but because it revealed something deeply human. We don't want to be pushed. We don't want to be convinced. We want to discover. We want to arrive. We want to look at a decision and say, honestly, this makes sense to me. Influence works best when it respects that inner need for authorship. Throughout this book, I've tried to show you one central truth. The most powerful influence doesn't shout, pressure, or dominate. It whispers, invites, and aligns. It doesn't steal control. It hands it back in a way that feels natural. When people believe an idea is theirs, they protect it, defend it, and act on it with energy that no external force could ever create. That is not manipulation. It is cooperation with human psychology. You've seen how resistance is rarely logical. It's emotional, identity-based, and protective. People resist not because an idea is wrong, but because accepting it threatens how they see themselves. Influence, then, is not about better arguments. It's about reducing threat. It's about making change feel safe, familiar, and self-directed. Once you understand this, your conversations change. You stop pushing doors and start opening them. You've also learned that influence begins long before the moment of decision. It starts with framing, with the questions you ask, with the options you make visible, and the ones you quietly remove from focus. It lives in pacing, in mirroring, in shared language, in timing. None of these techniques are magical on their own. Their power comes from alignment, when context, emotion, identity, and logic quietly point in the same direction. But perhaps the most important shift is internal. Real influence requires patience. You cannot rush ownership. If you try to force speed, you create resistance. If you allow space, people move faster on their own. This is one of the great paradoxes. Letting go of control often gives you more of it. When you stop needing immediate agreement, you become more persuasive. This book has never been about tricks. Tricks break trust. Tricks work once, maybe twice, and then collapse. What you've been learning instead is a mindset, seeing influence as guidance rather than domination, as choreography rather than collision, as a process of helping people see what already fits them rather than installing something foreign. You've also seen the responsibility that comes with this knowledge. Once you understand how easily perception can be shaped, you can't unsee it. You notice it in advertising, in politics, in social media, in everyday conversations. You see how often people are rushed, cornered, or subtly pressured into choices they don't fully own. This awareness is not meant to make you cynical. It's meant to make you conscious. Conscious influence is slower, but it lasts. It creates trust instead of erosion. It builds relationships instead of transactions. And in the long run, it's far more effective. People remember how you made them feel long after they forget what you said. If they felt respected, empowered, and understood, they come back. If they felt cornered, they disappear. Or worse, comply while resenting you. One of the deepest insights in influence psychology is this. People don't want to be changed. They want to change themselves. Your role is not to convince, but to create conditions where change feels like the person's own idea. That might mean asking better questions instead of giving better answers. It might mean staying silent longer than feels comfortable. It might mean allowing someone to walk away now so they can walk back later with commitment. As you take these principles into your life, your work, relationships, negotiations, leadership, remember this. Influence is cumulative. Every interaction trains people how safe it is to think around you. Do they feel free to disagree? Do they feel heard? Do they feel smarter after talking to you? These impressions shape future influence far more than any single technique. And don't underestimate self-influence. Many of the same principles apply inward. The way you frame choices to yourself, the questions you ask, the identity you protect. All of it determines your own decisions. When you learn to let yourself arrive at better ideas rather than forcing motivation, your behavior changes with less friction. You become harder to manipulate and easier to lead from the inside. If there's one final idea to carry with you, let it be this. The goal is not to make people say yes. The goal is to make people feel aligned. Yes without alignment is fragile. Alignment without pressure is powerful. When someone believes genuinely that an idea fits who they are and where they're going, action follows naturally. Influence done well feels invisible, not because it's hidden, but because it feels right, like noticing something obvious a moment too late and wondering why you didn't see it earlier. When people say, I don't know, it just feels like the right move, that is often a result of careful, respectful influence. So use this knowledge well. Use it to reduce friction, not increase it. Use it to clarify, not confuse. Use it to help people become authors of decisions they'll stand behind tomorrow, next year, and 10 years from now. Because the most enduring influence leaves no fingerprints, only ownership.